when that hunger starts to creep up, instead of pushing it away like many people do, they're at their computer, they're working, it's taking a break and eating, or having a plan for eating. And I think that's just one simple step people can take to start to develop body trust.
Welcome to the Unconditionally Worthy Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Adia Gooden, a licensed clinical psychologist who believes deeply that you are worthy unconditionally. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Unconditionally Worthy Podcast. I'm really excited to bring you this episode today. I have Wendy and Jessica from previously the Food Heaven podcast and platform, and they are now starting a new diabetes education platform, which is really exciting. And I'm so excited to have them on because theirs was the first sort of major podcast that I was on as a guest. They invited me, and it was really exciting to come on. I've been on their podcast twice, and now it's so fun to have them on my podcast. We talk all about our relationship with food, our relationship with our bodies, and how this intersects with a sense of worthiness. One of the things that we talk about is self-compassion and the importance of practicing self-compassion as we're journeying on healing our relationships with food and our body. I want to remind you that I have a course, Date Yourself 4 Weeks to a Healthy Relationship with You, that is all about getting rid of the inner critic, practicing self-compassion, and engaging in true and sustainable self-care. And so if that resonates with you, I really want you to check out that course. Go to unconditionallyworthy.com/date yourself to find all of the details. We will also tell you a little bit at the end about the new platform that Wendy and Jessica are creating around diabetes education so that you'll learn about that if that's something that resonates with you. Now let's get into the show. I am incredibly honored and excited to have Wendy Lopez and Jessica Jones on the podcast today. Wendy and Jessica are nationally recognized registered dietitians, certified diabetes educators, and founders of Food Heaven, an online resource exploring the intersections of wellness and social justice. With over 4 million downloads, their popular podcast, Food Heaven, dives into evidence-based nutrition, mental health, health at every size, food and culture, intuitive eating, and body respect. And I have been on their podcast a couple of times and was so honored to be a guest. And it's really fun to welcome them to this podcast today. So welcome, Wendy and Jessica.
Thank you for having us. We're so excited to bring this full circle.
Yeah, turn the tables a little bit. So I'd love to start our conversation by asking you each to share a bit about your own self-worth journeys.
I feel like it's ongoing. It's, it's always, it's never ending. But that's such a heavy and loaded question. I'm like,
I dive right into the deep end.
Right. I'm like, yeah, that's a heavy question. I feel like it's something that I'm unpacking in therapy.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think for most people, it starts when we're very young, and it's influenced by the relationships that you had with the people that were closest to you. And so, yeah, I mean, my childhood definitely had a huge influence on what I see as self-worth now. In my community in general, I would say, the people that I'm closest to, my chosen family, I think they have had the strongest impact on my self-worth in a good way. And just kind of like figuring out what that is and what that looks like for me.
Yeah. I will say similar in terms of unpacking it in therapy. I finally found a therapist who I really like, and I feel like she's helping me go to places I've never gone before. And one of those is like looking back at childhood and kind of where patterns come from, and how self-worth is determined. And I probably thought that I had a strong and solid self-worth before, but then in therapy, I'm realizing there's a lot of areas from childhood that have made my self-worth not as strong, and like trying to
Mm,
figure out where those come from. Like, for example, um, we moved around a lot and went to a lot of different schools. And one thing that I just like thought about was I never had a Black teacher ever.
mm,
And it's not to say that I didn't go to Black schools. Like, I went to a lot of different schools. So sometimes I would have been like maybe in a GATE program, like a gifted program, and I was the only Black kid, like within the context of a school that was more diverse. And so anyway, we were unpacking that, like, wow, what impact does that have on your self-worth,
mm,
being sometimes the only Black person in the class, and also like never having a teacher who looks like you, who you can look up to, who um is advocating for you, or you feel, reflected in. So I think that's something that I'm like, oh, okay, this is maybe why I have difficulties, like sometimes voicing what my needs are and things like that.
mm, mm. Thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people relate. I certainly relate. I think the thing about my experience is that generally, like, my life was good growing up,
Yeah.
right? And generally, my parents are good, great people and great parents. And there were still things that were missing for me. And there were still places and spaces in my home life with socially where I didn't feel good enough, or I didn't feel fully included or accepted. And I sort of came to conclusions about who I was and what was wrong with me based on those experiences. And I think sometimes, it's a big trauma or something really big that impacts our self-worth. But sometimes it's like little things and like small messages that we pick up along
Yeah.
the way, or experiences that are like, they're little nicks and cuts, but they don't necessarily provide this open wound that you can see and everyone can see. And so I do think that exploring our self-worth journeys, whether in therapy or, coaching or something else, like in a spiritual journey, is really helpful, because it
Yeah.
helps us sort of put these pieces together of like, oh, that's why I do this, because often there are sort of underlying causes for the patterns that we engage in that on the surface level, we just may not, know where it comes from.
Yeah, exactly.
You know. Well, you all obviously focus a lot about food, a lot on food and our relationship with food, and I think by extension our relationship with our bodies. And I'd love for you all to talk about what connections you see between our relationship with ourselves and our bodies and our relationship with food.
Mm. Well, as a dietitian who has worked with, I would say at this point, thousands of clients, I know firsthand that our relationship with food um, can have an impact on our relationship with our body, and vice versa. You might even say that like your relationship with your body is the first thing that's going to impact your relationship with food.
Mm,
Um, and also, having said that, I don't feel like I have all all of the answers there, and it's something that I'm still working through for myself. Like, what is my relationship with my body, and like what is that as I'm getting older too,
mm,
and like having your body change, or even during the pandemic. Um but yeah, I think for many clients, they end up using food as a way to control, or at least attempt to control their body and their weight, their
mm,
shape, their size. And so that can kind of cause like this fraught relationship with food, which then also has its own negative implications. So I think it's a huge thing, and we see it with so many people. And it's good that now there's more people talking about these things, and there's more accounts on Instagram, and there's more people fighting for social justice and body liberation and fat positivity. But it's still, we live like in a culture that's very entrenched in these like this thin ideal and diet culture. So it's something that is still a struggle for a lot of people.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think about, you talked about sort of like using, like having this controlling relationship with food, or using food to try to control our body to fit these unrealistic, often unhealthy ideals about what our body should look like. And then I also think about, how, we can also use food to self-soothe, and we can use food, right? And some of that is fine, right? But, sometimes we're sort of using food for a psychological purpose or mental, emotional purpose that, then creates this other dynamic that can happen. And so I can see certainly what you're saying, which is sort of like our relationships with ourselves and our bodies then sort of like impact how we see food, how we treat food, how we think about food. And I think there's so many ways in which like diet culture, not eating certain things, right? Like it's so ingrained in our language in when we go out to eat. Like I even catch myself being like, we're not calling certain foods bad. We're not calling certain
Yep.
foods, right? And it's like, there's no foods that are off limits. And I think that's one of the things I love about you all and the content that you put out, because it's clear that there's no like, this is healthy and this is not healthy, or you eat this or you don't eat that. It's freedom around like how you relate to your body, how you relate to your food is something that, is very helpful for us to all sort of work towards or move towards, so that we're not feeling restrained and restricted by what we do or don't eat, and then punishing ourselves and criticizing ourselves and all of the sort of outgrowth that can come from that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there's so much external influence when it
Mm,
comes to food now, whereas before, it was more so survival and even pleasure. Now it's just with the internet, I think even before the internet, there was so much information about food and what you should eat within the focus of like health through that lens. But now with the internet, it's just made it a whole different thing where it's constant, like the information that we're getting, and people get really like overwhelmed and confused, and what used to be pretty straightforward, is now a very stressful thing for a lot of people. Um, and so through our work, we try to kind of quiet out all of the noise and make food, straightforward, um, simple, not super stressful. And it's very complex, right? Because there's so many issues related to food, like food access and food insecurity and culture and then like just preferences, personal preferences too. But we do try to help people kind of tap back into that enjoyment and simplicity a little bit more.
mm, mm. Yeah, I love that, especially, yeah, the enjoyment and like I think when I think about sort of food and culture and how you all talk about accessible resources that are culturally responsive, it's like thinking about family gatherings, right? And family traditions around food and recipes and sharing in food, and how, unfortunately that also has been sort of squeezed out of our culture in a lot of ways, right? Like we do fast food, and whether that's actually like a quote unquote fast food restaurant, or you're just kind of quickly making something and quickly eating something and like eating in front of the computer and eating as fast as possible because you have to squeeze it into everything else that you have going on in your world, right? It seems like we can lose touch with those sort of nourishing aspects of food that are beyond like,
Yeah.
what are the nutrients and the calories that you're taking in, but also like, what does it mean to share a meal, to cook a meal with people, to share traditions, to share stories, all of those things. So I wonder how you all think about those things and incorporate that as you're kind of keeping an eye on being culturally responsive and working with people of color in
Yeah, I
particular.
actually wrote a whole article about the culture. Well, another article on the cultural aspect of food, but one on just how it is social as well, the social aspect of food. And I think that that is something that's very much overlooked. And I see this all the time in my personal and professional life, where people, I mean, even me, I can have a dinner at my house and someone's not eating it this time, or they're not, or they're not eating this, or this is off limits, or, oh, they're out of their window. And so it it becomes like then you're not able to share, like you said, like those moments, those traditions, like what good is Thanksgiving if you're not able to enjoy the sweet potato pie? And again, like I know that there's some medical reasons, certain people can't eat certain things, and I'm not talking about that. And also there's an element of like eat what makes you feel good too, and I respect that as well. But sometimes people just uh, become so limited with what they are eating, and they get in this very small box that doesn't allow them to enjoy all of those pleasures, and also be able to be an active participant within their cultural traditions too. Because I think, oftentimes when people might be diagnosed with diabetes, for example, they'll come to us and say the doctor gave them a handout of all the foods that they have to eliminate. And like, for many people, it might be eliminating a lot of foods that are cultural to them that it's not necessary to eliminate. Um, and I think that there needs to be a better job of like kind of understanding how important culture is to people, and how important those cultural foodways are, and how we need to preserve them. And B, also like, if nutrition is important to somebody, like how can we incorporate that in a gentle way, in a sustainable way, um, in a way that works for you? Because that's one thing that if I've learned anything over the last like 10-12 years as a dietitian, and even personally, it's like, let's get rid of all the noise and really tune inward and figure out what is best for you and your body, and what is that balance that makes you feel good physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, culturally, all those things.
Yeah, I really love that, because I do think in this, as you were saying, Wendy, age of the internet, it's like everybody says this is the right
Yeah.
way, right? This is the right way to look this way, to feel good, right? Like, and so there's not that many people who are saying there's a lot of different ways, and
Right.
you have to, here's the way that works for me, and
Yeah.
maybe try it on and see how it works, right? It's this works for me, so this is the only way, and this is the way. And so then you could find yourself sort of chasing after all of these fads and trends and not listening to your body in the process, like you're bringing up, Jessica. It's like, and then you're sort of disconnected from your body. You're probably not feeling very good. And you also use the word
Yeah.
sustainable, which is, it's very hard to sustain things like this if it's not actually in line with how you live, and also doesn't include some fun and some joy and some pleasure and some, all of those things. I think very similar things have happened with like exercise culture, right? It's suddenly not just like, hey, move your body in ways that feel good and functional and like find those ways. It's like 75 hard, and you got to work out twice a day for 75 days, no matter how you feel. And it's like, woo, like that is very intense, right? And you got to start
intense.
over if you miss a workout. Like, just like, whoa,
I
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. I feel like it's the way these things are marketed, it's like it's supposed to be hard, whether it's fitness, whether
Yeah.
it's food. It's
Mm,
like it should be a challenge. You should have difficulty, and it shouldn't be that way. You should actually be eating and moving your body with ease. It shouldn't be
mm,
something
Yeah.
that is a burden. And I mean, I've worked with people where it's a lifelong chase. It's like constantly doing,
mm,
diets after diets, and restricting and cutting this out and doing this to manipulate their body and their weight. And, in their mind, they're like, yeah, this is what it's supposed to be,
mm,
like this is going to get me to the desired result, even though they've been doing pretty much the same thing for over 20 years.
hmm,
Yeah.
Um, and it's unfortunate because people put like so much energy and time and money, especially into that pursuit, it's like, is that fulfilling? Is that,
mm,
what is that bringing to your life? Because you could really like reinvest that into so many other things that probably pay off a lot more. Maybe spending time with people you love, traveling, I don't know, whatever brings you joy. Like you could really just kind of reshift that focus and energy. But yeah, it's so complicated.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
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 I
That's,
was going to add, I think too many people are overlooking the basics. And and sometimes I overlook the basics. I was going to say, I'll use myself as an example. I have found that with most people, and even myself included, what is missing is eating consistently. Like that is literally the answer for 95%, I feel, of issues. And even for myself, like having a breakfast when I get up and when I'm hungry versus like waiting a couple hours, like it is night and day with mood, with energy levels, um, with having a bowel movement, like all the things. And so I think that we try to make it this complicated thing, and it doesn't really have to be. Sometimes it's very simple. And then I also think, going back to the gentle nutrition thing, one thing that I am really trying to focus on for myself personally is just like the why am I doing these things, right? Like, for example, I'm eating vegetables and making more of an effort. And I know I'm a dietitian, but like sometimes there's days when I don't eat vegetables, but I'm making more of an effort, not because I think like, oh, the vegetables are going to make me lose weight, or I need to eat vegetables for whatever reason, but more because they help to balance my blood sugar and I feel better, like, period. I'm not hangry. I have regular bowel movements, which also makes me feel better. And I like the way they taste, which makes my meal feel more pleasurable. So I think that kind of figuring out the why behind all of these things for you specifically, like your unique blueprint, and taking it back to basics is what's going to be most helpful for the majority of people.
Have you ever felt like a fake or fraud and worried that you'd be found out and fired? That's imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is one of the most common ways that low self-worth shows up in our lives. When we feel like imposters, we hide and play small because we don't feel like we've earned our right to be where we are. We don't feel good enough or worthy. The truth is that you're not an imposter. And in order to stop playing small and start playing full out, you need to understand what's causing your feelings of imposter syndrome and utilize proven strategies to overcome it. That is exactly what my brand new free e-guide on understanding and overcoming imposter syndrome shows you how to do. Go to www.dradiagooden.com/imposter syndrome to snag your copy today. Yeah, I love that, because I think part of what we're talking about is turning health into this achievement-oriented thing, right? It's like something you've got to chase after. And maybe if you do it perfectly, if you have your eating window and your fasting window just right, and you exercise just right, and you eat this many macros and this many blah, 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 right? Like it's like you achieve it, and then that's what makes you worthy, versus like you're already worthy. So how do you tune into your body and listen to your body and listen to what your body's saying about when it's hungry, when it needs nourishment, when it needs rest, like what, like how do you tune into that and then honor that? Like for me yesterday, I was hungry because the day before it was my birthday. I had a brownie for lunch. So I didn't have 3 full meals, which I know doesn't work for me. My birthday, it was okay. But then yesterday I was really hungry and I was kind of like, huh. And so we were like, should we get ice cream? But I knew ice cream is fine, but I knew that I really needed protein. I was like, a sugary treat right now, it would taste good, but I'm not going to feel nourished by it. So I was like, okay, let's just go home and I'm going to eat one of my beef sticks. And I did. I ate 2 and I made dinner, right? Like, and that is what nourished me, because I could feel in my body that I needed some solid protein, not just like a carby snack. And a carby snack, sometimes I'm like, I need carbs, and that's what I do. And so it's really about listening and trusting that my body's messages are things that I should honor. They're worthy of being honored, and trusting that my body's messages are something that I should follow more than an outside expert's ideas about what you should or shouldn't eat. And I think on top of that, sort of bringing in the race and culture piece, so many of these sort of experts are white men, white women, right? And I'd love to talk a little bit about how these sort of messages of diet culture can be really harmful, in particular to women of color, to Black women who maybe feel like we should follow them or feel like they hold the truth about what it means to be healthy, etc.?
For sure. Yeah, because a lot of the recommendations and the science, it's not based on our demographic. It's not based on Black people, period, or diverse populations. It's mostly based off of white people, and especially with the nutrition guidelines. It's so outdated and just so out of touch with the reality of most people. I feel even white people. It's like a lot of this stuff doesn't. It doesn't look appetizing in terms of like what the recommendations are. It's not very practical either for, the average person. Um, the guidelines for, weight and BMI, which is like such an outdated tool, that's also not rooted in like the reality of what the United States consists of. I feel like most people don't even meet, this like normal, range that they have set. And so that can really affect people, especially people who don't see themselves represented um, in these ideal food ways that are being promoted. For example, like the Mediterranean is one of the biggest ones. It's always touted as like, superior. That is the gold standard. But there's so many foodways from all around the world that are very plant forward and that don't get enough attention or enough research, really. Um, because the research is informing the recommendation. So if we're not really investing into other foodways and like, just seeing like what the health benefits of those foodways are, then that's very limiting. And so, yeah, I get a lot of people who think that they have to completely cut out the foods that they grew up eating. And it's interesting because a lot of these foods that, like, for example, Latin America, things like avocado, quinoa, um, that are now in, it's like the industry decides when it's in, like before avocado used to be a poor person's food, you ate it and, things like, eggs, you would like eat eggs, rice, and avocado to like get some nourishment so that you could work because you didn't have enough money to like buy things like, meat and things like that. And now it's like these foods have become so expensive and inaccessible to poor people. So it's just very ironic how like, the narrative is controlled by like industries that have a lot of money and that kind of get to decide what's in and what's out.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a good point that it's like if it's not in vogue, then it's like, why are you eating that? I'm like, oh, but then as soon as it's like, an influencer or somebody says you've got to eat avocados, then suddenly the research comes to back it up. Everybody wants to eat it. And as you're saying, the price gets jacked up. And I also love what you said about the research, right? Because I think often people will say, well, this is researched as the best. And it's like, okay, well, let's look at the problems with the research industry. Like, one, research is often focused on, white Western countries and people. And two, the things that are often researched are things that will make people money, right? And if nobody's going to make money off of it, it's probably not going to be researched. But that does not mean that our traditions and the wisdom of our ancestors was wrong. It just means that it hasn't been validated by these Western systems of research. And it may never be, but we can also still sort of pull from those traditions and then again, honor our bodies and see like, well, what does actually feel good for us?
Right.
Yeah. So I'd love to know how you all, when you're, working with people who want to have a healthier relationship with food, a healthier relationship with their body, maybe get back to enjoying this part of their lives. Like, what are some of the recommendations that you all offer to them?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's working on developing body trust.
Mm,
Because typically, many people who come to see us, or even people who listen to our podcast, or maybe it's being referred to them, um, they start out with really poor body trust. And that's why they feel like they need all of these external rules and regulations and counting and macros and this and that. And I think it's really about being able to tune into yourself and what your unique needs are, and being able to raise that internal awareness with, like you said, do you need a protein snack? Do you need sleep? Do you need rest? Do you need all these things? Like, kind of, yeah, being able to listen and respond to, right? Because that's another thing, is so many people, their body might be telling them something. Like, even me with the water, I was like, okay, I'm thirsty, my water bottle's out. Normally, out of water. Normally I'd be like, okay, whatever, it's out of water, but let me just do this podcast interview, it's fine. But I think being able to say, actually, let me pause, get my water, or like pause, go to the bathroom, get a snack, like that's really important, because then your body is able to trust that when it gives you a signal that it has a need, you're going to respond. Um, and so, yeah, one thing that can come up a lot with patients when we might first start working together, especially when I was doing more one-on-one private practice, is they felt like they were hungry all their time, or their hunger was erratic and all over the place. And I tried to explain to them that typically that can be because your body is not necessarily trusting that when it gives you a hunger
mm,
signal, you're going to respond to it, right? And so the way that you are able to have your hunger levels feel more normal is to eat consistently and have your body feel like things are predictable, right? Because the body does like some amount of predictability. And I think that that's like one place to start, is just, when that hunger starts to creep up, instead of pushing it away like many people do, their computer, they're working, it's taking a break and eating, or having a plan for eating. And I think that's just one simple step people can take to start to develop body trust. And if you're finding that you're not getting hunger signals, or you really can't rely on them at all, then what I might recommend is, like you were saying, maybe having like 3 to 4, 5, 6 meals a day, and kind of gently planning out some kind of time frame, just so you can get your body or your digestive tract used to eating again at a consistent schedule. And then with time, and once it starts to trust that you're going to feed it, you'll start to get those signals again in a way that feels like they're not so erratic and all over the place.
mm. I love that. And it's making me think of a number of things. So, one is, part of what I heard is like, we have to learn to trust our bodies, and our bodies have to
Mhm.
learn to trust us. Right. So it's sort of like,
Yes,
if I don't trust you to listen to me, then I'm going to be like, hey, 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 eat something, eat something, eat
that's
something. If I
it.
don't learn to trust that you're going to listen, and then also, how do we listen to those signals? But I was thinking about how ignoring our body signals and pushing past them, particularly for Black people, can be, rooted in slavery, right? Like, you think about our enslaved ancestors, they were not able to honor their bodies' messages that they are tired, that they need food, that they need rest, that they need water, right? Like, they had to ignore, like, they didn't have a choice but to ignore those messages. And then when they did eat, they made something out of scraps. They made delicious meals out of scraps that were then sort of looked down upon, right? As we talk about, like, looking down upon the food of people who are poor, it's like, oh, like, that's what you're eating, you're doing that, right? And it's like, they were doing what they could to nourish themselves for these hard days of labor where they couldn't honor their bodies. And so it just, to me, speaks to how important and radical and powerful it is for us to do something different with our bodies now, right? Is that it's sort of like shifting out of this legacy that our ancestors had to endure, and that we don't have to do that. And so, how do we start listening to our bodies, honoring our bodies, caring for our bodies in a way that our ancestors didn't have access to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even thinking like now with, in my previous position, I worked with a lot of undocumented immigrants, and it was kind of similar, especially for immigrants working in agriculture. Like,
Mm.
you're pretty much working 12 to 14-hour shifts and you can't really eat. And for a lot of people working in these conditions, they're renting a room. It's not like they have a functional kitchen. And so, how are you supposed to, tune into like your body's needs when you're living under these, circumstances? And so, with all of this, it's important to be flexible and, not think of yourself badly because you're not able to get it right. Um, not saying that everyone is facing those conditions, but I do this myself where like if something doesn't go according to plan, especially when it
Mm.
comes to food, I am just like, I'm really like, oh, I feel badly, or, it kind of, it's like a kind of a domino effect, right? Because then it starts affecting like other things. And it's like, it was one meal or one day or whatever, like a time in your life. Like this doesn't have to be so defining, for people. And it's okay if at this point in time, you're not able to work on things when it comes to food in a way that you think is ideal, because like there's so many things that we have to live with in life, like some people are just not in the position to work on these things at the moment for whatever reason, and that's okay, and that doesn't make you a bad person, or like you're not making bad decisions because of that, because you really have to, prioritize like what is gonna bring you the most peace right now, and like sometimes eating healthy is just not it. It's
Yeah.
not very realistic.
I love that you said that, because I think there are so many messages about you should get it right. And if you don't get it right, or you don't do it the right way, or you don't follow the rules, then that's on you, right? Like most of our messages in this country are, if you have a challenge with your health, or if you are experiencing like something, it is an individual problem that is completely disconnected from the reality that you are navigating, right? Like there's very little conversations in the broader public about food deserts and the cost of food and being able to have time to eat, right? Like there's very few conversations. The conversations are, if you are, experiencing, if you have SNAP benefits, you shouldn't be buying lobster, and that shouldn't, right? Like that's the conversation, not why do we live in a country where some people don't have access to food, don't have time to eat food, where people can't, where, food that is less nourishing sort of overall is way less expensive than food that is more nourishing, right? Like we're not having those conversations as a broad, I mean, you all are having them on your podcast, but, as a broader society, it's very individually blaming versus acknowledging society and the context. And I think the other part of what you mentioned is why I really love talking about self-compassion. And I like to talk about I've created a framework for Black self-compassion in particular, which is sort of acknowledging how you feel. I mean, that's part of core self-compassion, but that's part of like, even if you cannot meet your need, the need that your body is saying, can you even say like, I'm really hungry right now? Right. And can you even acknowledge, like, it's even if you can't address it, even if you can't eat a meal, it's like, okay, I am hungry right now. And so when I can get access to a snack or some food, I'm going to make sure to do that. Or I'm thirsty. And so when I can get some water, I will do that. And then, not judging yourself, not criticizing yourself for, maybe eating something that you hadn't planned to eat, or eating something that made your body feel not so good, and not being like, well, what's wrong with me? Because I think that's what often happens is people beat themselves up versus like, yeah, I'm human and I was starving because I didn't have access to a meal all day. And so when I got access to a meal, like, guess what I was going to eat? The carby, fatty thing that my body was craving at that moment. And yeah, maybe like this part upset my stomach and I know that I should, like this food upsets my stomach, but like it makes sense that that's what I ate because that's what my body was craving. And that doesn't mean, like I don't have self-control. It doesn't mean any of those things. It means my body was shouting at me at that point, and that's how I could quickly answer it. Right. And so having that compassion, and then I also like to talk about honoring your body, which is what we've been discussing, which is how do you treat your body with care and kindness, which is often so different than what societal systems and factors allow, right? Like you're talking about immigrants, and think about migrant workers, like people who are on their feet, people who don't get breaks, people who don't have sort of some of the privileges that a lot of us have to choose around food and make time for eating, right? That if there are small ways that you can care for your body, even in little ways, that can make a difference.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any other sort of recommendations that you would have for people as they're building relationship with food? So I feel like we've gotten listen to your body, also eating consistently, giving yourself grace as you go along. Is there maybe one or two more recommendations that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
I would say go for foods that are flexible and practical because, oftentimes what I've seen when people try to eat foods that are more nutritious, they buy a lot of fresh food that tends to go bad really quickly. And so, I think buying staples like canned beans, canned tomatoes, frozen vegetables, frozen fruits, things that have a longer shelf life, it allows you to have a little more flexibility and grace when, like, let's say you slip and then you're like, oh, you feel even worse because now your food is going bad and you're spending, you pretty much threw that money away. Try to stick with those types of foods, grains, like, all types of different grains that you can store. You can pretty much freeze anything at this point. So, frozen breads and things like that. Again, just so that you have more flexibility and it's not something that's bringing you stress. You can get to it whenever you're able to get to it.
I love that. And you're making me think of, there were a couple of reels that I saw going around the internet a few months ago. And it was like my weekly like mixed greens container that I like buy every week, put in the fridge, it goes bad, and then I throw it away. Or like,
Right.
it's my
Yeah.
apples daily trip out of the house. It's like, take the apple, don't eat it, put it back in the fridge.
Exactly.
And so I think just like normalizing that, because things come up, and like if a friend or somebody's like, hey, let's grab dinner, you don't want to feel like, well, I got this food and it's going to go bad, so I can't go to dinner. And then you're forcing yourself. It's like, if you have the ability to go to dinner, like enjoy that. And I think those things that you're also recommending, Wendy, they also make it more affordable, right? Like canned beans and rice and frozen fruits and vegetables are often much more affordable than fresh, and they stay for longer. And I think I also maybe would add in starting small and starting manageable. I think it can often feel like I've got to rework my whole diet and I've got a meal plan 7 days a week and do all the things. And I got to, it's like, how about start with like, could you eat breakfast that feels nourishing twice a week? Right. And like, what might that be? And when you're like, can you buy that stuff at the grocery store ahead of time? And so making it manageable, then you can build on it versus feeling like you have to have this Instagrammable diet and food plan that, people will approve of, versus like, hey, you know what? Like, I'm going to add an extra serving of vegetables one day a week and see how that feels. And I think that goes back to what Wendy was saying, is like, it feels like it should be hard versus like, no, it could be easy, or it could be simple and accessible, and starting somewhere is better than feeling overwhelmed and like nothing you do will be good enough, and then not, taking care of yourself and your body in a way that does feel good and nourishing.
Yeah. I can almost guarantee from my experience, there are maybe like 5% of people who do well with a complete overhaul and somehow stick to it and whatever. But 95% of us, it's just not going to work long term. even though you want to so bad and you're so motivated and it's like, I'm going to do all the things and I'm going to do them now and overnight, like it just never works. Save yourself the stress. And I like what you were saying about adding a serving of vegetables and also lean in on processed foods too. I buy processed foods all the time, things that are going to help make the cooking or eating process easier, whether it's I'm really into bag salads right now, just getting a bag salad, some smoked salmon, and maybe an avocado and some crackers and dressing and calling it a day, right? Like it doesn't have to be this thing where you're cooking every meal from scratch. Just think about maybe, 1 or 2 days a week, like once something that you can add to the meal. And also, like you were saying, see how you feel. Because oftentimes, and again, I'll go back to the vegetables, people think like, oh, I should be able to just eat this plate of vegetables and it's going to feel good. But that can also feel bad too. Like there's a lot of people where and I do not recommend eating just a plate of vegetables for the record, but there's a lot of people who they might find that certain vegetables don't sit right with them. And so again, that's part of the process of listening and learning about what
Mhm.
works best for you.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, I was going to throw in like, also don't just eat bone broth.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a big one right now.
I was preparing for colonoscopy and like, you have to just drink clear liquids. And so I was like, I was like, bone broth is probably the most nutritious thing I can eat in these 2 days because it's going to be rough. And so I was like eating the bone broth. I was like, this is not enough. For
No.
the
Oh,
record,
I mean, that's
this is
literally
not
just water.
enough.
Yeah.
At all.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. I have so appreciated having this conversation with you. I know it'll be really helpful and beneficial to the listeners. Will you share with people where to find you, where to connect with you?
Yeah, so our website is foodheavenmadeeasy.com, and on social media we're at Food Heaven, and that's where we're most active, even though we're not super active right now on there, but
There's lots
that's
of
where you
old
can find
content.
us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot. And I was going to also say by the time this comes out, we will probably have another venture company going on in the realm of nutrition and diabetes and prediabetes.
Hmm.
So we'll be talking about that on the Food Heaven platform. So if that is something that you want to get assistance with, definitely check us out.
That's awesome. That's so great to hear. And we'll link everything in the show notes. So thank you, thank you, thank you so much again. I really appreciate you all sharing your time and your expertise with me today.
Oh,
Yay,
thank
thank you.
you.